What is up, guys? So we are back today with another deep dive going into the Nightmare Cup. Today we're actually looking at one of the highly requested Pokemon, Lucario, and I have to say, Lucario, this is almost a repeat of last month with how just amazing Lucario is as a performer, with a few caveats, because this month Lucario isn't as overpowered as he could have been because of the other fighting types in this cup. So let's get into that. So, Lucario is actually a fighting and steel type Pokemon, maxing out at level 40 with 15s across the board at 2703. Very big CP there. A lot of his stats are pulled into his attack stats, so he does have a really high CP, which actually ends up making him not preferred in a lot of the PvP situations, because we do prefer a lot more defense and stamina with a really low attack. But having access to a few of these moves down here really makes him shine in PvP. So you can actually get 1494 at level 20.5 with a 1 on attack, 15 defense, and 15 stamina there. So even when you hatch a Riolu, if you really are pushing for the perfect IV spread, you kind of want to trade it immediately. Hopefully you get a really low attack stat IV with really high defense and stamina. Otherwise, just roll with it. You can hatch a level 20 Riolu with a too high of an attack. I have seen a couple of people, especially in my personal Discord, who have evolved them and they've been just over the 1500 mark, like 1503. So definitely go to either Game Press or use Pokegenie or Calc IV or whatever app you use or whatever way you can, and definitely run the IV spread before you evolve, just to make sure you don't waste those 50 candies. Hopefully you buy the move before you evolve it, so then you would have wasted 75 candies. Do a little bit of research before you do it, just so you don't end up screwing yourself over. Now, in terms of my spreadsheets and all the numbers that I have ran, Lucario does rank 56th in bulk and 49th in stat product. So you can see with such a lower bulk rating, that does tell us that his stat product really does come from his attack stat, which, like I said, isn't necessarily preferred in PvP, but definitely when it comes to his moves here is where he starts to shine. So let's actually get into those. So for his fast moves, we actually have Counter and Bullet Punch. Both of those are going to be stab moves. I do have them color-coded for you here. So Counter actually doing 3.5 energy per turn for 4 damage per turn, while Bullet Punch is the same at 3.5 energy for only 3 damage per turn. Now I do actually have stab worked out here in the parentheses, so after stab effect goes into play, Counter actually does 4.8 damage per turn, which is insane. Plus, if you calculate super effective on top of that, like, insane. Bullet Punch actually pulls out 3.6 after you factor in stab, which is pretty respectable, but in all situations here, unless we have Lucario in a cup where steel is just preferred over fighting for some reason, Counter is definitely going to be what you want to go with here, and even in several scenarios you would probably still want to use Counter just because of the raw damage output. But Counter is definitely preferred here. That's definitely the fast move that we're going to go with when we talk about all our simulations in just a minute. Moving on to our charge moves here. So we do have 4 charge move candidates: Flash Cannon, Close Combat, Power Up Punch, and Shadow Ball. So Flash Cannon actually being the only steel move that we have here, 65 energy, doing 110 damage at a 1.69 damage per energy ratio. So when you factor in stab, your damage does go up to 132, and you do actually hit a 2.03 damage per energy ratio, which actually ends up being the most efficient move that we actually have. Then we have Close Combat here for 60 energy. We get 100 damage at a 1.67 ratio there. Now after stab, we do bump up to a 120 damage for a 2.0 damage per energy ratio, which is definitely nice to see. Next, we actually have Power Up Punch for 40 energy. We do 45 damage, which of course isn't a lot, but we do have a guaranteed 100% stat boost based on our Power Up Punch there for a 1.4 damage per energy ratio. You're not using Power Up Punch because it's hard hitting. You're using it because you want that stat boost. So after stab, we do end up pulling up to 54 damage for a 1.35 damage per energy ratio, which is still on the low end compared to a lot of other moves, but not too shabby. Shadow Ball is actually our only non-stab move that we have on Lucario, but we end up costing 55 energy for 100 damage at a 1.82 damage per energy ratio. So pretty nice here. Out of all these moves, it's basically the exact same as last month for the Kingdom Cup, which is nice because it does saving you, whether you're having to use TMs or whatever. It does save you a little bit of trouble. I would just go with Counter, Power Up Punch, and Shadow Ball as my 3 moves there. Counter is going to be a huge player in a lot of the anything that's weak to fighting type deal, while Power Up Punch is going to guarantee you that just crazy stat boost, while Shadow Ball is going to actually help you cover some of the awkward psychic matchups that we're going to get to here in a minute. But moving on from our moves, let's actually talk a little bit about our shielding situation. So in a 0 versus 0 shield situation, we actually do end up winning 61.2% of our matchups, which is nice. It's not nearly as good as it was last month, if I'm not mistaken. We actually ended up doing a little bit better last month with a 71.8%. So while we do fall a few percent down this month, it's still not too shabby at 61. Now, in a 2 versus 0 shield situation, so whenever I have 2 shields and my opponent doesn't have any shields, we actually end up winning 86.6% of those matchups, which is pretty big, compared to last month where we actually ended up winning 92.3%. So as you can see, already Lucario's use case has been knocked down just a little bit. But in either case, so the reason that we run this simulation is to actually figure out what Pokemon are just going to straight up beat us. I want to know, even if I have complete shield advantage, which Pokemon are just going to beat us down. And actually that's most fighters here. So most fighters actually end up beating Lucario, or at least tying against Lucario. But we kind of can beat everything else when we have complete shield advantage. Next, we actually go into a 0 versus 2 shield situation. So when I have 0 shields and my opponent has 2 shields, I want to actually run this simulation to figure out which Pokemon do we just always end up beating. So if they have complete shield advantage and we just overwhelm them with damage, I kind of want to know which ones those are. And actually, I have written down that it's the dark types. Things like Sneasel, Shiftry, Tyranitar, and Alolan Raticate all end up falling pretty hard to Lucario. Now compared to last month, we actually ended up doing 26.9% of our matchups, which was really big back then. So this month, having a 19.4 definitely isn't quite as good, but still very respectable. And in our last scenario, we actually have 2 shields versus 2 shields, so this one is kind of like as a lead-off Pokemon situation. We actually end up winning 41.8%, which is not too shabby. So comparing these top and bottom 2 numbers here, 61.2 versus 41.8, ends up telling us that we definitely do actually, as Lucario this month, prefer to be a closer. Whereas last month it was kind of in a similar situation, but it was a lot more closer. Last month was 71.8 versus 65.4. So this month definitely there's a lot bigger of a spread here, which definitely just means that Lucario definitely prefers to be a closer. So now let's actually move on to some matchups with Lucario. So in every deep dive, I end up taking our subject Pokemon, Lucario today, and putting them up against our top 10 bulkiest Pokemon in the cup just to see how well they do. So this month with Lucario, it's not too different from last month actually. So let's actually go over these. So against Umbreon, Wobbuffet, Claydol, Alolan Raticate, Metang, and Grumpig. Yeah, Grumpig is in there. We actually end up doing really well. So a lot of these actually end up falling to us just simply based on a lot of our typing situation. And once we get over to our counters, we'll kind of understand the Grumpig and the Claydol matchups a little bit better. But in terms of what we end up losing against, we actually end up tying to Hypno and Bronzong, which is, I count that as the loss column because it's not actually like a straight up win. If we're gonna die, I want to at least count that as we died in that matchup as well. But in terms of Slowbro, Slowking, and Poliwrath, we all actually end up losing to all of those, which is kind of interesting. So to figure out why we actually end up losing to these Pokemon, let's actually look at our counters really fast. So in terms of what we do really good up against, we actually have really favorable matchups against the dark Pokemon. everything except Houndoom ends up just completely losing to Lucario. Houndoom is the only dark type that actually ends up running close to us, which is interesting because it has access to fire moves and it exploits the fire weakness that Lucario holds. But we actually end up having pretty favorable matchups up against some of the Psychics. It was almost like cut down the middle for these. Basically, if your Psychic type does not have Confusion, it really struggles against Lucario. And it kind of becomes awkward. So like, things like Matang and Grumpig, automatically they have a huge drawback because they don't have access to Confusion. They end up losing a lot of damage that the actual Confusion users actually end up helping us with. So it's kind of like with Counter, we have such an overwhelming amount of damage that we can output, and Confusion is the counter for Psychic types. So once we get into Confusion area for damage, we can actually go toe-to-toe with Lucario. But otherwise, we kind of just end up not having quite as much damage to output. So as far as what we actually end up losing to, fighters, everything literally except for Machop and Machoke will actually tie up against Lucario. So while we do lose to most of the fighters, Machop and Machoke will actually tie up against us. So at least if they decide to run one of those, there's that. And then in terms of the Psychic users, anything that can carry Confusion really does end up giving us quite a bit of trouble. But like I said, that Psychic matchup is kind of split down the middle. Do they have Confusion? Do they not have Confusion? Because that's kind of what I saw, at least, being the decider for a lot of the Psychic matchups. There are a few outliers with the Psychic type matchups, some that don't have Confusion but may have access to a super effective move towards Lucario already. Alakazam doesn't actually end up having Confusion per se. It does have Psycho Cut instead, but it has access to Fire Punch, which really can help it win in a Lucario situation because you can exploit that fire weakness that Lucario carries. So it's not just the Confusion and non-Confusion users. There are a couple of outliers, but I think that's a good general rule, is if they have Confusion, they're pretty much going to have favorable matchups up against Lucario. If they don't, then they pretty much aren't going to win, but there are a few caveats here and there. So, last thing that I want to talk about is a couple of pros and cons for Lucario this month. Basically, these are the same as they were last month, because as of now, as of recording this video, Riolu is still insanely hard to hatch, even though the Extravaganza event has happened. He did appear in 2Ks, but I'm pretty sure Weldon is still without a Riolu, and Weldon has been trying since, the same time that I have. So he's still outright just difficult to obtain, which it's kind of a good thing that he isn't as crucial to a team this month as he was in the Kingdom Cup, because now you can just use any other fighter that you want and still get similar performance. You won't get the exact same performance, but you'll definitely get similar performance out of the other fighters while still be able to beat Lucario, which is huge. So that is actually our only con that we have this month. As far as pros go, these are basically the same as last month. Lucario still carries a ton of resistances with his steel typing and fighting typing. He has quite a few unique resistances, like he doesn't carry that awkward flying type weakness. He's got some unique stuff going on here. If you do end up running up against a Pokemon that can squeeze in one of those weaknesses, it does end up hurting you quite a bit. And our only other pro is that Lucario still, to this month, beats a ton of Pokemon. He really just does plow through a ton of stuff. Even though his IVs and his stat spread isn't quite ideal for PvP, he still ends up just having an immense amount of overwhelming damage that he can output, especially with Power Up Punch. He's crazy. And I think any fighting type that we look at this month that has Power Up Punch, it's pretty much going to be very similar. They have an enormous amount of damage that they can output using Power Up Punch, and Lucario is very good to exemplify that. He's extremely, extremely powerful because he has an insane amount of damage output. So, that is actually all that I have for Lucario at the moment. honestly, if you have one from last month, I don't see any reason to not start to at least test it on teams. If you want to be that anti-meta guy, you may want to start looking at other fighting types that have more unique purposes, like things like Hitmonchan that may have access to Ice-type moves to help cover some of the other awkward Pokemon that maybe Lucario can't deal with. So maybe, like, if you want to go that anti-meta route, maybe there are other fighting types that we'll look at this month that may be more up your alley. But otherwise, Lucario is definitely a great candidate if you already have one. If you don't, we will definitely get to some that you may have access to. So, that being all that I have today, thank you guys so much for watching. Always remember, if you have any deep dives that you're looking forward to, please let me know down below. Since yesterday's video, we did have a few votes go for Heracross. Now there's like a huge tie between Bronzong, Heracross, and a couple of other ones. I can't really see it from here. Bronzong, Heracross, Poliwrath, Skuntank, Xatu, all those are actually tied for next, so probably what I'll do is just go in whatever order, alphabetically maybe, I don't know, until there's more votes coming in. Bronzong will be tomorrow's deep dive, so we'll go ahead and start jumping into that as soon as I can. I'll probably end up recording it a couple of hours from now just to get it out of the way. So, anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked it, like videos, make sure you do that. If you don't, you can be that guy. Otherwise, let me know what you have to say down in the comments below. And until our next video, I will catch you then.